Okay, so this is the audio review of Chapter 8, Surveys. Okay, so in general, in this chapter, they talk about the general features of survey research, variations in survey designs, variations in survey modes, the process of planning and conducting a survey, and of course, the strengths and weaknesses. So we'll go through all of that. All right, so they start out, the chapter starts out using an example that can illuminate some of the essential features of surveys and how they're constructed and really what they're trying to accomplish. So many things are constructed, right? Socially constructed in our culture. And family is one of those social constructions, right? So there's a social definition of what a family is, and how we define a family is very important to understanding these issues. So these social scientists wanted to measure this, how we understand what a family is, by creating a survey. So they created this CFS, and their core research question was, what living arrangements do Americans count as a family? So to find out, they used a telephone interview survey, and they randomly selected 712 respondents in 2003, and there were randomly selected phone numbers, and who answered the survey in the household was also randomly selected. So they asked many questions on topics related to family definitions, but they also asked questions about a variety of topics, including attitudes towards gays and lesbians, marital name changes, and the relative importance of biological and social factors in child development. They also asked background characteristics, such as what a person's age, education, gender, race, religion, and marital status were, so they could look at how an individual's background and life experiences and opinions on social issues relate to their definition of what a family is. So what they found in the research was that a little more than half of respondents identified same-sex parents with children as a family. They basically found 11 different arrangements, which they show in Table 8.1 in the chapter. So they found that 78.7% of respondents considered cohabitating couples with children a family. 55% said that same-sex parents with children were a family. And only 31% considered cohabitating couples or same-sex couples that don't have children as a family. So then they use all that other background info to understand the results better. And they developed 3 ideal types of respondents: exclusionists, moderates, and inclusionists. With exclusionists being the most averse to varying definitions of families, and the inclusionists on the other spectrum who were likely to see all arrangements as families. Then by breaking those down into different ideal groups demographically, we get an idea of which people tend to be exclusionists, moderates, or inclusionists. So, and in their research, they found that inclusionists are more often women than men, were more likely to be college educated, and were less religious than other groups, especially the exclusionists. So the book uses this example again to illustrate how the survey can be used to learn information about different groups, and how that information is collected and really can be analyzed in order to help aid a sociological understanding to answer sociological queries, right? Okay, so the general features of surveys. First is large-scale probability sampling. So professional surveys typically use very large samples that are chosen through scientific sampling, which makes sure that your sample meets the accurate estimate of the overall population that you're studying, right? So you can extrapolate it or apply it to the larger population. So, national opinion polls that are done pretty often typically have around 1,000 respondents. And it's important to look at, to accurately estimate the population's characteristics. So they develop these sample accuracy through sample design and sample size. So typically when it comes to probability samples, which use random selection, the larger the sample size, the more accurate the estimates of the population characteristics are. But this takes a lot of time and money to make that happen. And in reality, while it's ideal to have a large-scale sample, many surveys are used on smaller samples or are made from local populations to make them more manageable to administer and to complete. So there's also the issue of structured interviews and questionnaires. So interviewers follow standardized procedures for asking their questions. They basically have a list of questions and they move through them from top to bottom for each respondent that they're contacting. So some of the questions will have follow-ups if that's appropriate. But this is not the only kind of way to interview. There are also what are called unstructured interviews and semi-structured interviews. So unstructured interviews are when you have broad research goals and you have a topic you're asking about, but you make it more conversational. So you ask probing questions as follow-ups and really kind of make up questions as you go to supplement your findings. Versus semi-structured is really kind of right in the middle, where you have a list of questions you plan to ask each respondent, but you may also ask follow-ups or maybe other questions that come from information that a respondent gives you. So in my own research, though I wasn't doing it in a survey context, I have used semi-structured approach a couple times, as I feel it has a lot of flexibility to ask probing questions from respondents, because people like to go on tangents, and sometimes you get really good stuff from those tangents. So sometimes a respondent says something that your structured questions would not address. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, in my opinion, as you ask everyone the same questions, and you can later compare how different groups of people, whether it be their gender, race, class, level of education, political party affiliation, religion, whatever it is, you can see how those different groups understand your research topic. So most questions in surveys are close-ended, meaning that they provide response options, which some people see as a limitation, right? So it's how you feel about a topic, typically on a Likert scale, which is just that strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree scale that you've seen a bunch of times if you've taken a survey, right? These could also just be yes or no questions, but the whole feature of a closed-ended question is that you respond with a preset answer that's provided by the researcher, right? Versus open-ended questions are asking respondents to answer in their own words. So this can help explain why people feel the way that they do or act the way they do, more so than just finding that they do something, right? It's how they explain it, their word choice and associations that can really be interesting data for the researcher. And like always, which you pick has to do with what your research question is asking. So if you're looking for opinions and perspectives, then it makes sense to ask open-ended questions. Also, there's the issue of quantitative data analysis. So researchers that are using surveys are typically choosing close-ended questions because that lends them to being analyzed statistically. So this could either be descriptive or explanatory, right? So descriptive may be simpler in the way that they describe their findings. So opinion polls, right? They'd say like 40% of women said blank, right? But the explanatory surveys are using more complicated statistical analyses as they're really looking at relationships, often between more than two variables. So if you did use open-ended questions, or sometimes in surveys they have that little empty box where you can write in your response in your own words, researchers later code these answers for themes in a qualitative way, which we'll talk about in a second. So some variations in survey designs. There is a cross-sectional design, right? So this is when questions are asked at essentially one point in time, not meaning like in the same instant, right? But they ask as many respondents as possible in the least amount of time that's feasible. So like in political surveys, for example, the news and affairs of the government change. So if they ask some respondents, but then some time goes by and people start to see the world differently because of current events or other issues, that could kind of skew the response. So they try to be quick so that the respondents are in the same historical moment when they're answering these questions. And then there's longitudinal studies, which are where you ask the same questions at two or more points in time, which is usually done either with different groups of respondents or sometimes the same respondents, but in a different period of time. So this can really be through trend or panel studies. So trend studies consist of a repeated cross-sectional design where each survey collects data at the same variables, but with a new independent sample of the same target population, right? Versus a panel study is when you're surveying the same people again and again in separate surveys so you can see how their views change as they age or how their outcomes vary as they age or whatever it is, right? So the problem though with the panel version is that they're kind of costly and it takes a while to complete because if you're going to do this over years, right, you're not going to get all the analysis till later. And then when it comes to different modes of data collection, the book talks about different kinds of data such as face-to-face interviews, telephone interviews, computer-assisted self-interviews, and paper and pencil questionnaires, which we're going to go through each of those. All right, so face-to-face interviews. So obviously that means direct in-person contact between the interviewer and the interviewee. So it's the oldest and most highly regarded type of interview. The advantages are the interviewers can clarify and restate questions and ask for more complete answers. This is something that's lost in a paper survey or one administered by a computer. Also, the response rate tends to be higher than other modes because, they're staring you in the face. So they'll probably answer the question you ask more so than a phone call or a piece of paper, right? So this is really the best choice for lengthy interviewees because if you're going to take a long time with that, it's much better to have a person leading you through that. You're more likely to actually finish. But of course, the limitations are that they cost considerably more than other modes. So theoretically, you have to pay the person who's actually going to interview people. Plus, interviewing is an art. You need to be trained on how to do this so you can effectively do it. So then you need to transcribe what the person said. That takes time, or sometimes you have to pay for services. So either way, this is a kind of costly way to go about it. Telephone interviews are a bit more popular. Nearly all opinion polls are computer-assisted telephone interviews at this point. So some of the advantages is the saving in time and money, right? That's always an advantage. So this is why they're done so often. This allows for centralized administration and control. So if you're following a script and you're not diverting or asking probing questions, it's a quicker interview. And it's going to allow for centralized administration of that survey. So the limitations of this is that the questions have to be simpler with fewer response options. So that's not going to give you the same kind of depth. There's going to be more non-response to questions than in the face-to-face. Because people feel slightly less invested with a voice on the phone than they do with a physical human in their face. So, think about all the telemarketers you have hung up on in your life, right? It's easy to disconnect the humanity from some jerk that's interrupting your dinner with offers to refinance your home or whatever they're trying to sell. So that could be an issue with non-response. And it's really decreasingly lower response rates than FTF is really by increasing it's increasingly difficult to draw a random sample through this. So because you only have so many phone numbers, and this kind of becomes an issue as well. When it comes to paper and pencil questionnaires, I'm sure you've had to take these at some point. These can either be hand-delivered or filled out in a group setting. More often, you're taking the survey in a home or work or school setting than sitting all in one room filling it out together. So the advantages of the mail surveys is that they can be less expensive than interviews by a lot, partially because you don't need to actually train an interviewer. There's no telephone bills to pay versus the telephone version. And you don't really need a big office space to administer this stuff. And so the samples can be large and geographically dispersed because you're just putting it in the mail, right? You're letting the post office worry about it. So respondents may be more accessible than in interviews, meaning that when you mail a paper to someone's house, they'll see it, versus if you call when they're not home, you'll miss them, and you're not going to have that respondent's answers to your questions. So also another advantage is that the anonymity that happens in a paper and pencil questionnaire can protect someone's privacy and allow for more sensitive questions because they might be more willing to answer things without having to look someone in the face or even hear someone's voice, given that opportunity. Some of the limitations is that response rates tend to be much lower than interview surveys, so you feel even less compelled to comply or, with a piece of paper, obviously, that shows up at your door than you do with a phone call or a human face. So also there's no opportunity to clarify questions or probe answers. So what's on the paper is the extent of the answers. You can't ask them to clarify why or how after. So this also leads to more unanswered questions, which is a negative part of this too. Another method is computer-assisted self-interviews. So these can be transmitted by disk on laptop or via the web. By disk, that's hilarious. Most of you are so young, you have no idea what disks are. But I'm sure you know what a flash drive is or a jump drive. It's kind of like the same thing, only super limited. So anyway, to young people, disks are just the save button on Word. But anyway, I think you've probably experienced these if you've had to apply to a crappy retail job. They tend to have a terminal set up for you, and you just kind of take a long survey that you move through as you complete with a click to the next page until you're done, right? So you might have actually taken one of these. So the advantage of these web surveys is that they're obviously cheaper, substantially reduced costs. The online survey software facilitates design and delivery. So it sends it out to people, it does the random kind of part, it separates the information, so giving anonymity, all that kind of fun stuff. It requires much less time. That's also another important thing. So implementing it takes less time, especially in that retail job context. It's easier to go over there and take that computer survey when a person walks in looking for a job, more so than if you need management to be available to interview them on the spot each time one wanders in. So this can increase sample size at a low cost. And also, there's a flexibility in questionnaire design. So some of the limitations, though, are that response rates tend to be lower than other modes. So just like in the previous examples, the less direct human contact, the less likely people are to complete the survey. And then, of course, sampling frames generally high in coverage error as well. Okay, so, there's a lot of different modes, right? Different ways to go about surveys. So if none of the primary modes seem to be optimal for your research, there's always the option of a mixed mode survey. So you can use one mode to recruit, like a mail survey, to screen or to contact respondents, and another mode, like a face-to-face interview, to actually administer the survey. So if you send respondents a letter before they're asked to participate in a survey, that can really improve your response rate. You might also just use a second mode to ask a subset of questions. So an interviewer could do a face-to-face approach and ask the majority of the questions, but the personal stuff, like your demographic info, could be answered in a paper and pencil type survey. So it's not awkward to ask a person their ethnicity or how much money they make in a year. They could be uncomfortable in a face-to-face approach. Or you could use different modes to survey different respondents. So, that's another option as well. So, the advantages of this also include reducing your costs, increasing your response rates, and really improving your data quality by looking at it from different approaches. So when it comes to the process of planning and conducting a survey, we're going to go through each of these steps in detail in the following slides. But the first step is to choose a mode of data collection by considering the strengths and weaknesses of each. And of course, this depends on the goals of your research and the resources available. So then you can construct and pretest your questionnaire to see if there's any problems, and then amend it before you give it to your research sample. So while you're making the questionnaire, you have to be thoughtful about the wording of your questions. You have to pick very carefully what kind of questions you use, between open or closed. You need to think about how you're going to measure it, right, when you're making the questions. So there's a lot of information in the chapter about proper question construction, and also the chapter goes through where the questions should be located in the survey itself, and in what order. So we'll go through that. So in choosing a survey mode and sampling frame, selecting your survey mode and sampling frame are very interdependent processes. So your sampling frame in most surveys consists of a list of some kind. So like let's say if you're doing face-to-face interviews, you're going to need like the residence of the person you're interviewing, right? Or if you're using mail surveys, you're going to need someone's address. Telephone surveys are going to need someone's telephone number, and web surveys are going to need email address, right? So often there's going to be kind of a list involved in compiling these respondents. So when you're constructing the questionnaire itself, there's certain guidelines for writing your questions they talk about in the chapter. So first you want to create an outline of topics based on your research objectives, and where appropriate, you want to use or adopt questions from previous research that has already been kind of validated, right? And you want to really pay particular attention to your language. So you want to ask yourself the following things. Is your question containing ambiguous or imprecise words? So the example in the book is if you ask the question, how many years have you been living here? It's too ambiguous, so people might interpret it differently. So does here refer to your present house or apartment, to the city you live in, to the country? So it's important to be precise and clear about your question's language. The next one was, does the question use a negative word or prefix? So questions should be easy to read accurately, and sometimes if you put a negative word in a question, respondents kind of skip over it, and it changes the context of their response. The next one is, does the question avoid technical jargon? So you don't want to include technical words that a normal person in your population would not know, right? You also want to see if the question is double-barreled. So a double-barreled question is one that has two separate ideas that are presented together as one unit. So in the book, their example is a question phrased, quote, what factors contributed to your decision to marry and have children, end quote. So in the question, they're conflating getting married with having kids, though there may be different factors that contribute to those decisions that cannot be combined as one, or you're obscuring the results, right? So you have to make sure your questions aren't double-barreled. Also, is your question leading? So you want to know what the respondent thinks. You don't want to lead them to choose a specific answer because of how you worded your question. So you want to present questions in a neutral way and try to avoid emotionally loaded words and phrases that could affect a respondent's answer to a question, skewing your results. And then the last one is, are response options exhaustive and mutually exclusive? So this can be a frustrating thing for respondents when this is done wrong. So I'm sure you've had this experience. You're answering a question, but the responses are not mutually exclusive or exhaustive, so you feel like it could be more than one answer. If a question is close-ended, it needs to have enough responses that each person can answer it, meaning it's exhaustive, and the choices should be clear and different from each other or mutually exclusive. Okay, so as far as organizing the questions, once you've written the questions, you still need to figure out what order you're going to ask them in. This means you want to create an outline of topics based on research objectives. And really, one of the things they talk about in the book is the importance of making the opening questions relatively easy to answer. So this should be expected based on the introduction of the survey, that if you start with difficult questions, this could discourage people from completing the survey. And so you want to just start adding more demanding questions as someone is going on throughout the survey. So they also talk about that you should be placing background questions at the end. So we need that demographic info, your age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, whatever it is, right? But those things can be boring for people to fill out, so it's wise to have them near the end. And also, this is just common sense, you don't want to ask sensitive questions early in the interview. You want to allow time for respondents to become invested in the interview and develop trust, so that the longer you're talking, or even in the computer or paper context, the longer you're engaged in filling out the survey, the more your guard comes down and the more you get comfortable. So if you need to ask some sensitive questions about topics that many find controversial, you don't want to start with those, but you want to wait until later as they're feeling more comfortable by then, right? So you also want to group together questions on the same topic just for logic and measurement purposes, and you want to use transitions to improve the flow and motivate the respondents. So then you move into pretesting. So this is how you evaluate the quality of your survey questions. You could ask colleagues to critique the questions, or hint, in this class you have to make a survey, and that's me. You could apply schemes or software to identify wording problems. And then, of course, you can pretest it either in a laboratory, meaning asking respondents about their thought processes and answering the survey questions, right, where you have like a small group and then you kind of question them about their interpretations. Or you could just field pretest it, right, by trying out the survey instrument on a small sample and seeing what those results are. So once you move into actually collecting your survey data, it's a multi-step approach, right? So when they talk about in the book interview surveys, you're typically going to contact a household member, select someone to interview, obtain informed consent, conduct the interview, and of course, they're really going to try to make sure that you cooperate effectively. So that means they may call a number or attempt to contact a person numerous times, like as many as 20 or more times. So really just blowing up these people's phone numbers. And so attempts are made to convert those who initially refuse to participate. So this could be via the phone, in mailed paper surveys that they send out. Like they'll send out letters to remind you, or even more surveys to encourage the sample to participate, which is an important way to actually get a larger response rate. So then the next step, once you've actually got this data, is to code and edit the survey data. So you want to prepare survey data for analysis, and this involves coding and editing. So this is how you turn questions that you asked or were written on a page into some sort of numerical expression that can be interpreted statistically. So coding involves sorting data into numbered or textual categories, right? So close-ended questions are usually pre-coded in the survey instrument. So it's pretty straightforward, where you're typically going to assign numbers to a response category. So let's say you're coding gender. You could code it as 1 for men, 2 for women, so it's pretty straightforward, right? Versus open-ended questions are coded after data collection. This is more complicated, so many researchers use computer software to help them to kind of turn themes into answers, into numerical expressions. And so typically editing involves checking for errors and inconsistencies in responses. So if you did code gender, let's say as 1 for male and 2 for female, and you had no other or non-binary category as an option, then you wouldn't want to see like a number 3 or a number 4 in that kind of category, because that clearly wouldn't make sense. Really anything but a 1 or a 2. So editing and checking is also important before you actually turn this information into something you're interpreting statistically. So most editing is programmed into computer-assisted interviews, which is really kind of another bonus feature of those kinds of interviews. So when it comes to overall the strengths of survey research, obviously it's generalizable to the larger population, right? That's kind of the whole point. It can provide accurate estimates of population characteristics. So, that obviously is a big, big plus. They're versatile. So you can cover a lot of topics with one survey. You could have a lot of attitudes, beliefs, and values about all sorts of stuff all layered in one survey. They're also efficient. right? You have numerous questions that can be addressed in the same survey. And you also might get unanticipated findings, right? So especially if you're asking open-ended questions, or if you have an approach that's more semi-structured, you can then ask probing questions and find things that the researcher did not anticipate in their initial questions. So, also the secondary analysis of surveys is also very cost efficient as well. So when it comes to the weaknesses of survey research, it does provide relatively weak evidence about causal relationships. So it's not as clear as it is in an experiment, right? So most surveys are a cross-section that they can interpret what, they can about what's going on at that time period. But it's not as direct a relationship between variables, kind of examination, the way that experimental research methods are. So there's also measurement issues. So first, you're measuring what people say, not what they do, right? And as we know, people are not always honest about what their behaviors are. It's not always as effective. Sometimes watching a person is much more effective, right? To see how they actually act, not just what they say about how they act. Also, the surveys themselves are susceptible to reactive measurement effects, and they really aren't going to provide a context to understand the behavior that people are expressing. So it's more so just opinions and attitudes at one place in time, but not necessarily why people hold those particular opinions and attitudes.